Hi, I'm Tiffany Pewitt. Welcome to our Migration Narratives Project Showcase. This is our third showcase in which we've been able to share the wonderful work of our Migration Narratives Project's grantees. Today, we're really excited to be able to showcase the project, The Truth in Our Stories. And we have with us the project team, Elizabeth Wright with Justice for Our Neighbors Austin, Monica Tornoe with Undocumented Stories, and Jesus Esparza with Texas Southern University. And I will turn this over to them and let them share their wonderful work with us.
Well, so great. So thank you, Tiffany, for this wonderful opportunity. And thank you to those who are attending and watching. And certainly thank you also to Liz and to Monica. Their partnership and their mentorship really throughout this entire process has been nothing short of appreciated. So, but yeah, we, and I'll say this, I was invited to join the team. Monica and Elizabeth were sort of the leads, if you will, on this project. And I came in to assist with the manuscript that they had envisioned. And so we ended up, and there's several parts that we can discuss here in a moment. I'll keep it brief as we introduce what the whole project is. But there were several things that were done as a result of this endeavor. There was a beautiful video that was done of the 12 stories that we captured. There is some online content that has been made available as well. And then what we also did was put together a manuscript of some of the stories that we captured when we spoke to 12 brave souls throughout this process. And so I came in and assisted with the storytelling component and really sort of contextualizing the project, as it were. And we titled our book, The Truth in Our Stories, Immigrant Voices in Radical Times. And it's not the first of its kind, but it's groundbreaking nevertheless, in that it is the accounts of individuals who we identified as some of the most scapegoated persons within the country and beyond. And our hope was that this manuscript, that this short book, and the testimonies from these persons, the hope was that those stories would help, as Liz called it, help shape our misshapen understanding and misshapen narrative, that is the narrative that describes the immigrant experience for a century now, for over a century. And we are starting this coming month, we are going to showcase this book and begin to PR the book and hold events and workshops and communicate with educators, because the objective isn't to write for scholars. We weren't writing for scholars. We were also maybe thinking politicians, but we want to write for teachers, and we want to write for students, and we want to write for those at the ground level, so that we can begin to implement change and change hearts and minds from the ground up. Policy changing from the top down is hard to do. For a century, we've been trying to do that. I'm not saying it's impossible to do. I'm just saying it's hard to do. And sometimes it's easier to start at the bottom. And so this is our hope with this book here, The Truth in Our Stories, Immigrant Voices in Radical Times. Myself, Monica, and Elizabeth served as the editors, and the press certainly, they took us to task. They made sure that we were on time with our writing and that it was accurate. They fact checked and they did all those things. And it's really my first experience working on a manuscript of this kind. And it's a memorable one. I'm glad that that it was with such important stories and such an important topic that I think isn't spoken about positively enough. So I'll turn it over to Elizabeth and Monica if they have other things they'd like to share.
I think for me, one of the things that has always been important about this project and highlighting and reiterating over and over again is that it is centering these 12 stories, these 12 persons, their voices, these 12 migrants, immigrants who have, some threads that are shared in their story, but who help to bring humanity into the conversation and center that. And I think that's part of what, as someone who makes presentations to community members who want to learn, and that's its own, that's a subset. We hope, in fact, too, that we can reach folks who maybe aren't sure that they know much about the immigration story, but to start that work centering migrants' voices themselves, to not only rely on data or a historical account, but to use those as context to surround the very human nature of life that we're living together side by side right now. I think that's part of what it's just always important to continue to circle back to and reiterate as we think about this. And that's the foundation of this whole project that was presented to us when we applied. The centering that was putting migrant voices first. But that's just so needed. I mean, borrowing from the title even in a different way, that is so radically needed. So often we're talking about and we just kind of really extract. And so what I love about the title as well, The Truth in Our Stories, is that's what we're really trying to marry together in people's minds, is to have human stories from people that are in our community, that we live around, that we work with, that we, are already integrated with in our lives. And to know that those aren't just anecdotal, those are an example of what we can see in wider data. So that's part of what my portion in the book is about, is kind of trying to also say these stories fit into a wider narrative. And here's some of what you may believe a completely inaccurate untruth about, or lie, or manipulation of information, and therefore a manipulation of people, right, as part of it. But also, so it's like not leaving either thing alone, not leaving it as just a story, and also not leaving it as just data, but to really help marry those two things together, to say, listen, this is the reality. And I'm so glad Jesse already used this word too, or Jesus, that, he's reminding us all that rooted in all of this is such, scapegoating and oh gosh, I just think it's such a dehumanization and a mischaracterization, and it's all done so it's always keeping people further and further away, like not just at arm's length, but then starting to put things in the dark, and turning people into dark people and places. And so this is about kind of shining that light back on, no, here is someone's own voice shining light, and also revealing the light that they bring into the world, and who they are, and who they are just in and of themselves, what they've endured, how they persist, their resilience, all of that, their strength. I think that's another aspect, and I don't want to step on something that Monica might want to say, but I think that's another aspect to highlight in the book, is that there's really hard, difficult stories to read. And yet all of them are also a reminder all the time that that's not the only way to characterize a person. It's not just those things they've experienced, and that there's more story coming. And I love that in so many of the stories too, how the storytellers took time to also share, an allusion to what's next, if not kind of an excitement even about what's next in their story. So I'm really proud of the idea that we've taken these ideas together, and the concept of the truth in our stories, that there are stories that are revealing the truth, and that the truth is undergirded by these stories. But also just that we're trying to provide that to our community in as many ways as we can to reach them. And so I think Monica, I'm sure, have more to say about all that's coming up. But yes, I also have my physical book out by me too. We've got these books, and they are such a wonderful resource to be able to return to. We've got 8 of the stories recorded in full in video, and a composite of them. So each person is their own story, of 8 of them that we could get in a sit down, and then a composite of those 8 that is then a little less than an hour to hear pieces of their stories woven together. But there's so much more. And I also just want to take a moment to point out that, like, on our book, we've got this QR code so that we can continue to add to this resource. And that's the hope, is that even as this project was a particular timeline with some particular goals, this is an ongoing thing, right? Like to be telling the truth and to be centering migrant voices. And so that's what we want to continue to do in our work together. And I'm going to see if Monica wants to say something, not talk over her.
Yeah, thank you, Lizzie. Yeah, for me, it was just such a, such a gift, such a blessing to do this in collaboration. You know, in a world where individualism is, reigns. And I wanted to collaborate. Really, I wanted to do this with other voices, and to not only not to tell the story in my perspective, right? I wanted to give those voices a platform, right? They're telling their stories in their own voices. So I'm not telling the story. Usually you hear that people are telling somebody else's story, right? I wanted to provide a platform. That was very important. And if you look at the beautiful book, their faces are right there in the cover, right? That was also very important to me to have the faces in the cover, because that was is giving them back their dignity, right? That has been stolen from them, and these are human beings, and their stories are just powerful, and they're resilient, and they contribute, and they do all these things. But first of all, they're human beings, right? So they deserve dignity and respect. And so that's been such a joy to do that. The book also includes history, a brief history, of immigration, which is always important, and also the data, which is also important. Some people want to look at the data, so we make sure that to include a little bit of history and a little bit of data as well, as a support of the book. And this is an extraordinary resource to teach about immigration, and like Jesse was saying, we want to teach students, the next generation, so that they don't have the same problems we have now, right? And our desire is to be in school districts, to be in high schools, in the curriculum, to that this book becomes part of the curriculum in schools and in congregations, in small groups, and that they really you can really study and learn from this book. And we even went further, and with the videos we created, we developed a course. So it's an online course that you can take and go through each of the videos of each of the stories, and then go through processing questions. We understand that the stories are packed with a lot of information, and you have to process them. So we also developed those really good processing questions, and the course is also going to work with a facilitator. So we're going to form groups, and people can join, and a facilitator will go through those videos and those questions to process, which is super important. So we have that resource available. Just yesterday, I was just finishing up the page, so that we have everything in one page. So we have the book available to order or to pre-order, and we have the information. We have the video and the information of the course. So there's always more for people that want more. That's what we want to offer, and because the goal is to educate people. I think that we can bridge our differences really with more education. There's a lot of ignorance, a lot of stereotypes out there, but education can help with all of that. So thank you, Tiffany, for the opportunity to let us talk about our beautiful project, and thank you for funding it. We wouldn't have done it without you.
Yeah, here. And another thing on regarding the title, the subtitle of the project is Immigrant Voices in Radical Times, and so the word radical in this case has a varied form of meaning. Our times are radical. The world is watching war take place. We're 6 days, maybe 16 days maybe into it. And certainly here stateside are, things are radical regarding the immigrant experience. The world is still under a pandemic. That's radical. But it has also another meaning in that, perhaps that we can become radical thinkers and finding ways to decolonize and deconstruct our immigration system. When we think about immigration reform, I don't think that we're radical enough to get the job done. I think that we have to really sort of push that envelope and really sort of put our radical hats on to create the change that most Americans want to see created. And so again, that word radical expresses the times that we live in, but also is a hint at perhaps times to come for positive change. And so we hope that that double meaning or that triple meaning or that quadruple meaning for people really resonates. And we're not trying to trick anybody. We are, like our storytellers, we are unapologetic and honest and open about it. And we are, as we feel it, speaking truth to power. And hopefully that impacts and makes change at the grassroots level, at the mid-level, at all levels. The other thing I'll say about these stories, they're fantastic too. And I remember the day that we all gathered to do it on the campus of the seminary, the Presbyterian Seminary in Austin, Texas. And I had met some of the storytellers there that day. I had arrived late, and Liz and Monica were already there. They were there all day doing it. I mean, just the testimonies are powerful in and of themselves. The opportunity to sit and learn and listen to someone share their experiences, even for a moment, penetrates the very soul. If you were paying attention, it penetrates like nothing else. And these stories really sort of, this is what we use to try to counter the narrative. The narrative is that immigrants are a purge or a plague and the dregs of society, that they are disease-ridden, that they are hyper-violent and so forth, that they're a drain on the economy. And this is the narrative. Listening to these stories, you tend not to think that thing anymore. You tend not to fall into that same sort of flow, and you begin to ask, well, why are we saying that? Because here's a person who taught me, right, that they have multiple jobs and they are working several jobs, and that's not a drain on the economy, that's boosting the economy. And so, but they help us unlearn some of the things that we have been taught and sort of conditioned to believe from very early on. It's in our music, it's in our movies, it's in our media, it's in our classroom. And so the power of storytelling and the power of truthful storytelling goes a long way to helping to unlearn a lot of the misconceptions that we have about the immigrant experience, the immigrant body, and the immigrant families that they form. The other thing, right, we were talking about, Monica mentioned it, about getting this into the classroom. I think that this book coming out now it's perfect timing, because as we all know, in Texas, there is a fight over sort of the curriculum in the classrooms, K through 12. And many persons have taken over school boards to demand that those school districts ban what they are identifying as the teaching of critical race studies. That is also misshapen. That is not accurate in many ways, because when you think of critical race studies, it's a framework. It's not something you teach, it's something you use to teach. It's a framework for teaching something, and it focuses on race. There's also critical labor studies, critical women's studies, and so forth. But they're focusing on race here. And so, and that framework is also very confusing to a lot of people, but it's actually quite simple. It's sort of, you sort of take the unhoused population. Like, I live in Houston, Texas, and we have a sizable unhoused population. And looking at these persons who are panhandling at stop signs and at road intersections, we might say, well, look at that person. That person is homeless. And in Houston, a great portion of our population that are homeless are people of color, Latinos, African-American, and so forth. And so we might say, well, look at that person. That person is homeless because that person didn't work hard enough, or that person didn't go to college, and that person gambled his, we can say, though, we create these sort of stories. Using critical race studies as a framework, we might begin to say, well, what factors are in place that cause that person to become unhoused? Are there racist structures in the way we finance homes, for example, that resulted in that person, who most likely is brown or black, to become homeless? Are there racist structures in housing altogether that determine those factors. And so that's what critical race studies does. It helps us sort of ask different questions and think differently about certain things. And all that to say was that this book here, the release of this book, I think it's perfect timing, because it would help quell the dissent and really the confusion. It would help make sense of the confusion that is taking place in those school board meetings. And then that will then, again, release teachers from these punitive laws. I mean, these teachers are being threatened with fines and other kinds of job loss and things like that. There's a witch hunt in many ways, where parents can now, by pressing a button on the link on the website somewhere, turn the name in of a teacher who is teaching quote unquote critical race studies. Again, you can't teach critical race studies. It's a framework for teaching. But I think that the release of this book is going to help undo a lot of the problems that we see in school board meetings and in our classrooms K through 12.
Well, and that sparks a thought. I think, I think all of this goes together, but I am going to return to kind of where you started with looking at that word radical and the many meanings it has, and also how you've emphasized this is timely. We are looking at images every day right now of refugees, but this isn't new to have refugees on our screens or refugees in our lives. And I know refugee can be, in my work, we always are careful about talking about there are official ways we use the designation refugee, but also just the idea of people fleeing for any number of reasons in that broader sense. And to be radically honest and unafraid and speak truth to power right now, it is not to diminish the horror of what we see in the current moment of what's going on in Ukraine. It is to bring people alongside and say, however you're processing that right now, how would that come alongside how you process these stories? How would that come alongside how you process the stories of the community right around you? Because there's so much already that is pointing to what you're saying to Jesus about what is already racially embedded into how we think and process and and examine problems, people, situations, all of that. There has already been splashed across our screens and in our news over the last few weeks, plenty of examples of how we approach conversation about immigration and fleeing danger with a racial lens. And we need to continue to approach that and pull that apart and deconstruct it and decolonize it to say, to begin to approach a person, a situation, a disaster, a crisis with humanity in mind first, right? And we're not there yet. We in other ways, we shouldn't let the racial lens go down of just dismissing. That's what you're saying, right? Is you could just dismiss somebody as, well, they didn't do enough, or they didn't this, or they that. And that's a lot of what I think we see when looking at immigrant population in the US is well, why can't, the phrase, and just to be clear, I work with attorneys who are helping to get people through the legal process of immigrating, and specifically very particular humanitarian lenses. So asylum and what's called special immigrant juvenile for status for children. But the number of times I hear the phrase, why can't people do it the right way, right? That's the dismissal of oh, these people who just won't do it the right way, who won't just do what they're supposed to do. This book will tell you all about people who are doing what they are supposed to do, who are following the process, and who are facing a system that is inherently trying to keep them from the safety they seek, from the thriving that they could have. Who cannot get medical attention, even if they wanted to get the medical attention they needed in the ways that other people do. It's not just, can I pay for it? It's being squeezed out at every turn. And it's built on racist foundations through and through. And until we begin to pull that out in every place, we won't be able to get down to that foundation. But I think, a radical moment right now where we have we are being reminded every moment on our screens right now about people who are looking for safety and help, and how we approach that how we're listening to stories of people talking about how they're fleeing, why they're fleeing, what safety they're looking. We're hearing stories right now like that right now on our TVs. And it just seems so, I mean, I keep saying it's important to hold all the emotions together, right? It's infuriating to hear those stories and not be able to do something about that. It's also infuriating to think there are stories of your neighbors right around you who are being dismissed and diminished and dehumanized every day because their story, even though it may seem really similar, they look different possibly, or the place that their story starts is different. And for whatever reason, we are letting our systems continue to dehumanize people based on their nationality, their race, etc. So I think when we talk about radical and timely, we're in a very precise moment right now where that matters, to be examining and to be critical of, even as we mourn and fight for justice for a whole set of other people who are in distress right now too.
You know, in the book, and Monica, please, if you wanted to speak next, you could. In the book, we address, you know, there's a moment there in the first few pages of the book where we address that a lot of the movement of persons from Latin American countries, for example, who arrive into the United States in massive ways outside of Mexico, because Mexico has always been the nation to send the largest population of Spanish speakers into the US, sort of the right way or the wrong way. And I use that with my fingers, right? My quotation, sarcasm fingers. But beginning in the 1970s, you would have thousands and thousands of persons from Central America, places like El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala, who would come into the US seeking refuge. They would come as asylum seekers. And this is, again, these waves of immigration into the US would spur, as we indicate in the book, these massive anti-immigrant sentiment, these nativist sort of campaigns to thwart that movement of this invasion, what they called an invasion. But, you know, and many people don't know that a lot of that exodus on the part of those populations, whether they're from El Salvador or Guatemala, that a lot of that is the result of clandestine involvement on the part of the United States in those nations. I mean, we went there looking out for our best interest, and we dictated outcomes of a sovereign nation, the political outcomes, the economic outcomes, and so forth. And that caused war. It caused war in El Salvador. You'll have 50,000 Salvadorians who perish as a result. It caused war in Nicaragua. And when we think about Reagan and Reagan's dirty little war, in Guatemala, you'll see 200,000 people are going to be murdered. And I mean, you'll see some of the longest civil strife in Latin America as a result of US clandestine involvement into those territories. And so, you know, there's a journalist who has coined the phrase and who has termed that the harvest of empire. That is sort of, we are, that's caused by the US involvement. And as a result, these persons come to the US for protection. And then that it's a vicious cycle, and it's a vicious cycle that sort of repeats itself over and over. But, you know, Liz mentioned, you know, sort of these people are trying to come the right way, but the system is set up in a way that doesn't let them come in the right way. And then I'm saying on top of that, added to that, is that these people are coming in the right way, trying to come in the right way, and then are forced to come in the wrong way because of our involvement in their territories. And this book is, again, speaking truth to power. And some people might not like that, but it's something that, you know, if we're going to be honest, let's be honest. I say that all the time in my classroom, and the word truth is in our title. And so this is what this book hopes to do. This is what these stories are going to definitely do. This is what the video that was compiled is also doing as well, is trying to explain. This is why there was a great number of persons coming into the nation. This is why they are not allowing, or this is why they are using very dangerous routes to get entry and access into American communities and so forth. I mean, you look at things like Operation Gatekeeper, one of the largest, most sophisticated efforts to militarize our southern border. It's called Operation Gatekeeper, and it would take place in the 90s and 2000s. And it shut down major ports where people were coming into the US, and that consequently forcing people to find other routes, more dangerous routes that often led and resulted in their tragic death due to dehydration, malnutrition, animal attacks, and murder. And so, but yeah, I mean, this is what we talk about in our book for several pages in the first few pages of it.
And I mean, interestingly, we have a new volunteer who started just this morning, a young volunteer, and that's exactly what we were talking about. He said, here we cause, in the US government is often involved in driving the factors and also forgets that those factors have ramifications for decades afterwards. I mean, we just have such a short term memory, and we also think about immediacy so much that we forget that these things have ramifications for decades. So it's not just a war is happening during a certain time in the 80s, say, the ramifications of that economically, socially, militarily in a nation last decades and have effects on people's migration. But we're talking about how we create a problem and then punish people as they seek to flee a problem or to resolve their lives into a safer position. We punish as we create a problem for it. But there was something else right there at the end, Jesus, that you reminded me of too, but I wanted to jump back to that for a second. I'll give Monica a chance to jump in and maybe, or I don't know, Tiffany, if you have some questions you want to pass our way, but
well, you remember what you were going to say. I think that we focus so much on I'm looking at immigration as a problem, right? Well, immigration has always existed, right? Will continue to exist. Immigration is just part of of human beings, and as climate changes, more and more, and we've seen those changes. We've lived through those changes. That's gonna keep happening, and so, in my opinion, we need to find solutions to this instead of just trying to build more walls and trying to just have this hostility. It's just we just need to focus on more on solutions on how can we welcome, how can we do already immigrants already, it's already proven that they contribute to the economy, so they're not a drain. So how can we make it legal and equitable for everybody? So I think that solutions are key for that. We are, and this is like, I don't know, we're not there yet, but I wanted to also, before I forget, to invite to our launch parties. We're going to have several launch parties, and we're going to have those available on our web pages and social media, so that people get connected and come, because that's the goal, to get connected with everybody and bring this educational tool that is a tool, so it can be used. Anybody can use this tool. Did you remember?
Yes.
And Monica, you said something that reminded me of something that I'd like to share. Because I think that Liz, in the second part of the book, right? It's a two-part book, and in the second part of the book, Liz sort of really lays out how immigrants contribute. And you can see the data there. So they're contributors. They have houses, they build infrastructure, but they're also patriotic, because you look at World War I and World War II, you would have immigrants who served with the armed forces during those conflicts overseas. And then you would also have immigrants who are filling the voids, both in World War I and in World War II, filling the voids that were left in the agricultural fields and the industries, as a result of many of the people who were there previously having to go fight overseas. I mean, you would have at least 14,000 immigrants fighting overseas, and then you'll have about 200,000 immigrants, mostly from Mexico, but from everywhere, working and harvesting and growing America's food during World War II under a program known as the Bracero program. Now, it wasn't perfect. There were problems, but these were immigrant men, and using their bodies, their labor, their hands to grow America's food, to feed Americans at home during the war, and to feed American troops overseas abroad, and the allies of the U.S. Armed Forces. And so not only do they contribute to the economy, immigrants are patriotic to this nation. They're as patriotic as you and I are. And so yeah, Monica reminded me of that, and I wanted to make sure that I threw in there also the patriotism and the work and the labor that they did, both during the First War, the Great War as they called it, and then the Second World War.
And now, I mean, if we bring it back to now, and that's where I do remember I have my pen in my brain of the other thing, and these things can go together because they're both about right now. You cannot eat unless you are growing all of your food in your backyard and you take it with you anywhere you travel. You cannot eat without having been touched by an immigrant's work and labor, because if you're eating out, you're being touched by immigrant labor. If you are eating anything you buy at the grocery store, unless you shook hands with a farmer and know, like at a farmer's market, or you grew it yourself, so you know for sure there wasn't an immigrant involved, it is near impossible to consume a meal without being touched by an immigrant. And so that is a now thing as well, that there's a stepping up, but there's a continuation of that we eat because of the hands of immigrants that feed us everywhere. In every context. You're going to go travel somewhere, the immigrants in your hotel are also feeding you as well. So I want to say another matter of right now, and this concept of scapegoating, and how instead of seeing the solutions and the contribution, I don't quite understand myself. I'm not the scholar that Jesus is, but I am a history student. And, you know, one of my short cuts to talk about immigration is to kind of say, like, the history of the world is migration, right? Like, if you're going to study history, you're going to be studying people moving from one place to another, conflicts that arise within that, disasters that drive that, any number of things, right, that can drive people, economic opportunity, hello, the United States, you know, and colonization at large. So migration and history are tied together. It will continue because history will continue, right? And so instead of always approaching things as a problem, being able to say, what does that mean then, to harvest the energy of that for good, and to not continue to drain our society into this constant battle and dehumanizing process that we go through. But we're still in it. I mean, right now, Title 42 is still a policy that is keeping migrants from being able to come into our nation. And it is founded on the principle of keeping the public safe from a disease. That we just had a State of the Union where people were not wearing masks. So it was apparently safe to be Americans inside a building together, gathered. It's safe to be an American citizen and travel, or to be someone who fits the right kind of immigrant category to travel back and forth across the border for any number of reasons without a concern. The United States has some of the least, like some of the most lax rules about reentry with travel, and traveling all across the nation. But here we are right back. I mean, I feel like I'm reading a story about Ellis Island and checking people for diseases, you know, at coming off of the boat kind of thing. This long narrative we've had forever of talking about disease related to it's such an old trope. It's disgusting that we continue to enable it in this way. Even physicians organizations, like global physicians organizations, talk about how inappropriate it is and how unhealthy it is for us to be justifying keeping people at the border because of a concern about disease spread. And they're like, that is the action that will cause more problem than processing people through in the system that's already in place. And so we're still doing that scapegoating and still trying to take a problem we have and misdirect our energies, as opposed to allowing for the flow of history that has always been, and how do we capture that flow to leverage for good instead. So it is infuriating. We're still continuing Title 42, even at we're hitting the 2-year anniversary of Title 42, and it is not immigrants. I mean, if everyone else can travel freely, it is not immigrants who are bringing the disease, but that is the narrative we're still putting out there into people's minds, even if it's not directly. That's the narrative we're giving is, well, we can't let immigrants in because of disease, though.
And you're right, Lizzie, that is absolutely an old adage. I mean, it's birthed out of, it really becomes this movement during the 19-teens and 1920s known as the Eugenics movement. And it was essentially scientists and medical persons from the medical establishment who convinced politicians and other lawmakers and so forth. And it was a movement that really negatively influenced American society moving forward, because it argued that immigrants, specifically immigrants, you know, had these, you know, biological inferiorities. And it was because of who they were, where they were born, what language they spoke, what religion they subscribed to, that those were the factors that really sort of corrupted them and so forth. And so the idea was that immigrants, as Lizzie indicated, that the perception was that immigrants brought disease, that they brought crime and poverty, and time and again you would see that that adage emerge again, and we saw it also with the war on drugs. It was this with the war on drugs here within the United States in the 1980s. The perception was that the drug problem that exists in the United States is a result of the drugs being brought in from Latin America, and that immigrants were bringing crime, and that there is a war on drugs in the US because there is unchecked immigration from Latin America. And so this eugenicist movement and its proponents would come and go, and they would be political leaders, they would be in law enforcement agencies, they would be church leaders, they would be leaders of all kinds. They would have the microphones, they would be in front of the television stations, they would write with pens and then type with typewriters on the newspapers, and really sort of spread this idea that persons from outside the US do not belong and should not be allowed because they can corrupt physically, emotionally, economically, socially, the fabric of society, right? And so, I mean, we have Title 42 still in place. Also still in play is several states trying to undo the deferred, right, the DACA program.
Sure.
We have detention centers that are privately owned. The private prison system is tied into that. We have
I want to interject real quick to say we still have the drug connection being made mistakenly. The president spoke in the State of the Union for about 1:45 total about immigration, and somehow managed in that time to tie that minute and 45 seconds together with including information about controlling drugs at the border. And I'm like, you can talk about the border if you want to, but if you're going to talk about immigration, there is no reason to tie your conversation about immigration to drugs. That is a problem of a narrative that continues, and that is a problem that we are presenting that publicly still, that if we're going to take 1:45 on immigration, we're surely going to need to talk about drugs at the same time. It's just not true. Talk about drug control if you want to, but there is no need to tie the two things together when you're talking. Because that 1:45 was talking about trying to get people the protection that they need, the safety they need, basically alluding to asylum and needing to make some progress on reopening that back up, and then immediately jumps to drugs. There's no reason to talk about people needing safety and drugs in the same sentence. And yet that's what we had in front of us as a nation from our leaders in the 1:45 that we get about immigration in that State of the Union.
And then the other thing, thank you, Lizzie. The other thing is that they don't talk about detention centers and the atrocities and the inhumane conditions that exist in detention centers, or they don't talk about the agents of the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, ICE, and how they operate oftentimes outside due process and things like that, and how there are people who die while in the custody of ICE. Or they don't mention the policy regarding asylum seekers. And so they seem to only talk about drugs, the border, and immigration, but everything else is sort of, it's left to the side, and it's not part of the main course. And it should be part of the main course, because this is going to help prevent the violence that continues to plague this community, and the tragedy that befalls immigrant families and their citizen-born children and so forth. So, yeah.
Thank you for sharing all of this, and for making these important points about how important this project and resources for shifting the narrative, the very problematic narrative that's come to dominate our public discourse. I'm wondering if you could also talk a little bit too about the process, your process in developing this project, and you've mentioned that that kind of at the heart of this project also was creating a space for immigrants to tell their stories on their own terms. So tell us more about what that was like, how you got connected with these 12 folks, what their kind of involvement and input in the project was, how you created that space for them.
Well, so the project that I manage on undocumented stories, we do that. We always, I mean, I'm always in contact with undocumented immigrants. I'm an immigrant myself, you know. Let me start by that. And so I've lived through all this, and I came with a visa, and I'm, you know, I'm documented, right? But I've been through all the discrimination, and I've been through all this horrible things that I've experienced here. And I thought, you know, if I've gone through them, you know, how bad can it be for undocumented immigrants? So that's where, you know, that was my what motivated me to start this undocumented project, right? And so I've been, and because of a lot of my work, I'm in contact with a lot of immigrants, and a lot of them, we had a previous relationship with them. We do storytelling events where we do highlight 3 to 5 immigrants in one event, and they tell their story live. So prior to telling their stories, you know, we go through a process where we shape their stories, right? The stories are shaped, and these are not professional speakers. So I mean, it's also a process of overcoming that public speaking, right? Which is always hard. There are great stories, but unfortunately, they don't want to do the public speaking, so that's always hard. And so some of those folks have already been connected through undocumented stories or through other projects, and it took a little bit of convincing me to share their stories because it's not easy. First of all, there's a trauma, there's the public speaking fear, and some of them didn't want to do video. You know, some of them just wanted to do to share their story, and until they felt comfortable. The story was shaped, and they had to prove it, and of course, it took a lot of listening, you know, sitting down, a lot of time, you know, to spend with them and really listening one-on-one, and until, you know, the story took the shape. You know, stories are long, you know, so we have to focus on certain parts of the story, right? We cannot focus on, and they're still evolving. So it's a period of time in their story. We just calling somebody's story feels like, you know, that's it, right? But the story is still evolving. And so it's a time in their story, you know, of, you know, what they've experienced as an immigrant in the U.S. So after that, you know, after we shaped their stories, then we recorded them. They were ready, and it's the ones that were wanting to be recorded. They were recorded professionally. We took their pictures, almost everybody's pictures. And you will see in the book that there's one that we couldn't put up his picture because of security reasons. It was the best picture. I wanted him to be on the cover, but unfortunately we couldn't because of safety reasons. It's only his shadow. But he tells a really strong story. I mean, a really powerful story, and it really tells about all this power structure and all the corruption, you know, because we're always, like Lizzie and Jesus were saying, you know, about the narrative, right? And his story really talks about that because he sees the corruption on both sides, right? And he really sees it and experienced that. So very interesting process, and I don't know what else to tell you. We recorded the story, we took the photos, and, you know, they had to, but we walked along the process. You know, it was a long process, but we had a relationship with most of them. Mm-hmm.
I think what was humbling for me in part too on that day that Jesus was referencing where we did the recording is just like observing both, like having to approach, like Monica said, trauma as you tell the story each time, even, right? Like, and being allowed into that space with someone, but also like the deep pride of being able to express your story and your voice and be able to name who you are without holding back, and without kind of yeah, someone else trying to shape it for you. There's just, it was a very powerful day. And so also just knowing how some of the contributors, you know, spoke of that pride and said, I want to do this. And I hope this, like this makes me excited to think I can help shape this in a new way by sharing my story. I think that was a really powerful thing. And we're hoping to have with those launch events, again, I know we kind of keep circling around to that, but with launch events coming up soon for the books, we hope to be able to have some storytellers present because we want to honor them. We want to continue to honor what they have gifted us all with in creating all of these resources.
Yeah, and I'll echo similar sentiments. You know, one of the things that we always must consider when we're asking people to share testimony is the possibility of them revisiting trauma, because that is always there. And the PTSD that from that trauma, it's with them. They wear it like they wear shirts. And so that is always a concern. And certainly that was a concern. I always just think about that. I never want to have someone to re-experience that. And this is why I called them brave when we first started our session here. That's a brave thing in and of itself to do, is to speak of that trauma. But then I also found it's been my experience and with the persons that I've interviewed and my experience doing interviews and oral histories, that the act of doing an oral history and speaking of that in many ways is empowering. And it releases a lot of the stuff that they may not have spoken out loud before. And so like when we speak to veterans, for example, veterans or the spouses of veterans tell us, you know, I've been married to him for 30 years and he never talks about this. And it just becomes a release in many ways. And so these storytellers are going to help educate others, and they are going to help re-educate others. But I hope that us three, that Lizzie, Monica, and myself, that what we did, at least for a moment in providing that space for them, is that we help them coming to terms with some of their trauma and releasing some of the things that they were maybe still holding on to. And they really, I remember saying one time after I heard a storyteller, I said, oh man, that's super cute. That was a super cute ending to the story. And she was so nervous in doing it. I mean, there wasn't that many people in the room. There were the camera crew. It was us three sort of sitting on the side, making sure we weren't in view. And people were real nervous, and it could be nerve-wracking because it looked like a real sort of movie production, the way these gentlemen had it all set up. And so Monica and Liz got some great connections for these guys that came and did the shooting for us.
Well, and I think it also becomes a point to build on that. It also possibly opens the path for someone else to feel empowered to share their story when they see someone else has shared, when they hear an echo of something, or just the echo of trauma, or the echo of whatever it might be. It can, I know in my own experience of that, in my own experiences of trauma, when someone else is able to say it, or when I have shared a story, I've had the person say, I really never would have said it, but I felt like because the space had been opened to it in a new way, and you seemed so confident about it, then I thought I could share my piece too. And so I think I know for sure that one of the storytellers, that's his perspective, is I'm telling this because I'm tired of people feeling that they have to keep their story quiet, you know. And there are several storytellers who share how much of their life they spent trying to kind of contain and control the narrative of who they are, to look as different from who they truly are as possible in a lot of ways, and to hide a lot of who they are as an immigrant from their community and their closest friends and supporters, you know, mentors and things. And so, you know, the number of times where that kind of empowering, standing up and facing forward and you know, just like unabashedly, like it happens over and over again. And I think it will inspire that. I mean, that's another residual. I think what I love about having a physical resource, not even just a one-time event, is then this continues to pass into another person's hands and another person's hands and another person's hands, and can continue to open that up in new contexts and for new people to feel empowered by it, not just educated by it, but empowered by it as well. That's exciting to me.
Well, thank you so much for sharing about this really amazing project. And I look forward to being able to read the book and to being able to attend some of your upcoming events and hearing more about all these amazing resources that I think are going to be really impactful on just helping people think differently about the way we talk about immigration in this country. So thank you for joining us today. And I hope you all will join us for our next Migration Narratives Project Showcase that will take place in a couple of weeks.
Thank you.